What if I told you that the man who led 1.4 billion Catholics didn't call himself holy? He called himself a sinner? What if I told you that he died the day after Easter Sunday, right after giving his final blessing? Coincidence or divine choreography? This is not just the passing of a pope, it's the closing of a chapter written in ashes, mercy, and unshakable compassion. It's the final breath of a man who turned away from power and chose instead to walk barefoot among the broken. They called him Pope Francis. But for many, especially those in the faith Christian center, among the poor, the migrants, the wounded, the forgotten, he was simply the voice that listened. He never wore his title like armor. In his first public interview, just months after being elected, he answered the question,
"Who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio?"
Not with a title, not with a parable, but with a sentence that stunned even his critics.
"I am a sinner."
That moment didn't make the headlines like his travels or tweets did. But for those familiar with the social teachings of the Catholic Church, that confession shattered centuries of silence and reintroduced humility into a world where even religion often worships perfection. He was unlike any pope we've known. He didn't rule from golden halls. He lived in a guest house. He didn't seal himself behind Vatican walls. He went to South Sudan, Myanmar, Mongolia. He kissed the feet of warring leaders. He wept beside refugee boats. He dared to use the phrase,
"Who am I to judge?"
In a time when religion is often used as a weapon, he tried to make it a refuge again, echoing the mission of getting us to Jesus and reflecting the very heart of Jesus' ministry. At Grace Christian Church and across marked Men for Christ, many felt something shift during his papacy. A gentle reckoning, a painful hope, a quiet revival. The truth behind believes, we've grown too used to seeing popes in halos. But maybe the ones who leave the deepest mark are the ones who walk away from the spotlight, so that the light can fall on the lost. The question is not, did he succeed? The question is, will we listen to the silence he left behind? Candle, this is the beginning. But if you lean in, you might just hear the whisper of something sacred.
The trot behind.
A life that shocked the world, and a death that whispered to heaven. It wasn't just that he died, it was when he died. On Easter Sunday, millions saw him smile, wave, and bless the crowd in St. Peter's Square, an old shepherd standing in the glow of resurrection. Weakened but radiant, less than 24 hours later, on Easter Monday, he was gone. The timing was so precise, so loaded with symbolism, that many ask not just in faith Christian center communities, but in hospitals, homes, and parishes around the world. Was this a divine coincidence, or something deeper? It felt more like a final act of love than a tragedy. While most popes spend their final days behind closed doors, Pope Francis chose a different path, one that echoed the heart of the Catholic social justice teachings. He did not die in a palace. He didn't even live in one. Instead of the apostolic palace, the official residence of the papacy, he spent his final years in a simple guest house called Santa Marta. There, surrounded not by marble and tapestries but by visiting clergy, housekeepers, and the occasional refugee, he ate with staff, prayed with janitors, and remained until the very end accessible. He was not a man of titles. He was a father, a friend, a pastor, to some, even a living parable. He walked among the people, and just as Jesus did in the important Bible stories, Francis became the kind of leader who lived the gospel first before preaching it. In his final public week, he ignored medical orders to rest. Instead, he visited a prison, weak, breathless, leaning on aids. He didn't have the strength to wash the feet of inmates at that time, as was his custom, but he still went.
"Why are you in here, and not me?" he asked them.
A question that wasn't just rhetorical. It was Francis, the man, laying bare the moral weight of mercy. Even the inmates wept. His decision to be buried outside Vatican City, at the Basilica of Saint Mary Major, was yet another testament to his pastoral heart. He had visited that Marian shrine after almost every major trip, praying silently before the Virgin, leaving flowers, seeking comfort. This wasn't just a final resting place. It was a return home to prayer, to simplicity, to the spiritual connection that sustained him. In many theology courses, students are taught to trace the theological legacy of popes. With Francis, one needs only to trace his footsteps. Because everywhere he went, he left behind more than doctrine. He left behind stories, short Christian stories with moral lessons that could fill volumes, though none more powerful than the story of how he chose to live, and how he chose to die. Some deaths are a period. He was a bell. A call to wake up, to listen, to carry forward a torch that was never meant to stay in Vatican hands but to burn in the hearts of those who believe in love over law, mercy over might. Today, in congregations from Grace Christian Church to Victory Christian Fellowship, there's a silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of sacred weight. Because when a man like Francis leaves this world, he doesn't disappear. He becomes the question echoing in every believer's soul.
Will you now do what I no longer can?
And that is where this story leads. Not to an ending, but to a handoff. Because every resurrection begins in a tomb, and his voice is still speaking. The Pope of the Peripheries. He didn't sit behind polished marble. He didn't hide behind gold embroidery. He went where no one wanted to go. Namely, to the places we forgot. While many church leaders spoke from pulpits and palace balconies, Pope Francis flew to the edge of the world literally. He visited South Sudan, a nation still scarred by war and betrayal. Not to speak from a podium, but to kneel, to kiss the feet of rival leaders, begging them to choose peace. He journeyed to Mongolia, where Catholics make up less than 2% of the population, simply to remind them, you are not forgotten. He stood at a makeshift altar on the Mediterranean islands, where thousands of migrants had drowned in search of hope. He offered Mass on an altar built from pieces of shipwrecked refugee boats, wood soaked in salt, blood, and grief. It wasn't a press stunt. It wasn't for headlines. It was a sermon in silence preached to heaven itself.
He did not choose the stage. He chose to kneel.
For many around the world, especially in the Catholic social teachings tradition, he came to symbolize a radical shift. A pope who did not see himself above suffering, but saw Christ within it. His legacy was not confined to cathedral walls. It echoed through sweat-stained shelters, refugee camps, and dusty backroads where his predecessors had never set foot. And in doing so, he breathed life into the words often lost in repetition.
Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me.
This vision echoed loudly within communities like the Christian Reformed Church, where justice and mercy are not theological abstractions but imperatives. In Marked Men for Christ and Grace Christian Church, he was often cited not just for his papal authority, but for his authenticity. In a world teetering under nationalism and indifference, Pope Francis became known as the Pope of the Peripheries. To the marginalized, he wasn't a distant figure. He was a presence, a guest, a listener. He spent more time outside the Vatican than most popes had spent inside. He didn't build walls, he crossed them. For many Catholics in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, places often dismissed by church bureaucracy, Francis brought dignity back to their doorstep. Even when his positions drew fire from conservative voices in the West. Even when his embrace of "He gets us" Jesus messaging felt too open, too risky, he stood his ground. Because for him, The edge of the church was not its boundary. It was its beating heart. He modeled what many of us have long prayed for. A leader who embodies the social teachings of the Catholic Church. Not just in words, but in flesh and footsteps. He never needed to say he cared. He showed it. He reminded us that Christ was not found in ceremony, but in the suffering. In every generation, there comes a prophet who moves the center of our faith, not by rewriting doctrine, but by relocating compassion. And that's what Francis did. He didn't change the church's message. He changed its direction. From inside the palace, to outside the gates. Because the true test of a church is not how loud it can preach, but how far it will walk to find the lost. The man WHO unlocked a new theological door. He didn't tear the house down. He didn't rewrite the rules. But Pope Francis did something far more dangerous. He asked questions. And for a church long shaped by answers, that was revolutionary. Many Catholics, especially those shaped by the 7 Catholic social teachings and the Catholic social justice teachings, had grown used to hearing doctrine from above, commandments handed down, decisions declared. But Francis changed the rhythm. He invited people to speak back.
We are not the bosses of the laity.
He once said,
We are servants.
It was a sentence that didn't just resonate, it disturbed. Because suddenly, those in pews were no longer passive listeners. They were participants. The center of this shift was the Synod on Synodality, a name that may sound like Vatican bureaucracy, but in practice, it was one of the most daring things a pope had ever done. He gathered bishops, priests, lay people, women, and even critics and told them not just to attend, but to speak. He invited voices from the Grace Christian Church, leaders from the Christian Reformed Church, and theologians from across continents. He asked questions like, should the church consider blessing same-sex unions? What does real inclusion look like? Should celibacy remain mandatory for priests? And what about women? To the outside world, these were ordinary discussions. To the Vatican, they were earthquakes. Because dialogue threatens control, some wanted him to shatter the vase. He simply loosened the lid. And yet, in doing so, the water of truth began to pour out. Perhaps most famously, Francis uttered the now iconic words,
If someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has good will, who am I to judge?
In just 17 words, he redefined the tone of a centuries-old institution. He didn't change doctrine, but he changed the climate. And for many, especially LGBTQ, Catholics and allies, including communities like He Gets Us, Sidiaton, and Marked Men for Christ, that change was more than symbolic. It was oxygen. It was a sign that the church might finally be able to speak with people, not just at them. Still, that same courage exposed Francis to criticism from both sides. Traditionalists accused him of watering down orthodoxy. Progressives called him too cautious, too slow. But perhaps that tension between mercy and tradition is exactly where true faith lives. His approach was deeply pastoral. He understood that the human soul doesn't bloom under threat, but under listening. And that's why he encouraged debate, not as division, but as a path to deeper communion. In the spirit of the social teachings of the Catholic Church, he saw disagreement not as heresy, but as holy ground. In a world brimming with noise and outrage, Francis opted for something quieter yet more disruptive. He didn't shout, he opened a door. Not a floodgate, just a door. And in that small gesture, he trusted that the Spirit, not a slogan, would lead the way forward. His actions mirrored the wisdom found in many theology courses and spiritual reading circles. The church is not a fortress to be defended. It's a field hospital, reaching out to the wounded.
Heal first. Ask questions later. Francis said, "You don't ask a man dying in the dirt about his cholesterol."
This wasn't soft leadership, it was a radical mercy that echoed through every decision he made. From removing outdated titles in the Vatican, to expanding leadership roles for women, even if he stopped short of full ordination, to apologizing publicly for past failures in abuse cases. His theology wasn't just about what the church taught, but about how the church sounded. In spaces like perpetual help novena gatherings or retreats at Christ Chapel, Catholics found in him a shepherd who didn't demand perfection, but invited presence. Even his critics, many in traditional dioceses, often confessed,
"He made us uncomfortable, but maybe that's what prophets do."
Francis reminded us that faith is not a cage, it's a conversation, and when it becomes a dialogue, it becomes real. He didn't end the debate, he sanctified it. And maybe, just maybe, that's how revival begins. The Pope of the digital age and the communications revolution. If you told someone 50 years ago that a pope would one day livestream blessings, that he would send tweets from the Vatican, or post prayers on Instagram in 9 languages, they might have laughed. But Francis didn't just step into the digital world, he baptized it. While others saw the internet as a threat, Pope Francis saw it as a gift from God.
The internet, he once declared, "It is a gift if it is used to bring people together, not push them apart."
And with that, he became the first pope to fully embrace digital platforms, using Twitter, Instagram, Facebook Live, and beyond. His blessings went viral, his images, captioned with humble prayers, circulated across generations. And in doing so, he brought the message of Christ not just to cathedrals, but to cell phones, not just to pulpits, but to podcasts, not just to the Grace Christian Church and Victory Christian Fellowship, but to the hearts of people scrolling quietly in hospital rooms, subways, or lonely kitchens. One now iconic moment. A live stream of Pope Francis during Easter week, rain falling. Crowds hushed. He lifts his hand, and the comments section explodes.
Watching from Texas. He gets us. Pray for my mom. Thank you, Holy Father.
This wasn't just communication, it was communion. He wasn't trying to trend, but he did. Across platforms, he reached more than 63 million followers. His posts were simple, no filters, no polish, just the truth. One line in particular shared on Instagram was screenshotted, printed, and taped to kitchen walls.
God never tires of forgiving us. We are the ones who tire of seeking His mercy.
This message resonated especially with followers of He Gets Us Jesus and the growing movement toward spiritual authenticity online. It echoed through short Christian stories with moral lessons, and even found its way into YouTube homilies and TikTok devotionals. His presence on the web wasn't accidental. It was intentional. It was mission-driven. Just as Paul used letters and the early church used scrolls, Francis saw spiritual reading in pixels, prayer in hashtags, and Jesus' ministry in YouTube comments.
Jesus walked among the crowds. Francis once said, and today, the crowds are online.
He wasn't the Pope of clickbait. He was the Pope of connection. The one who reminded us that sometimes, a smartphone can become a sanctuary. Even critics, those wary of social media, couldn't deny the impact. Because in this noisy world, Francis made room for a whisper. And in that whisper, millions heard hope. The man WHO stood against power without compassion. He wasn't sent to please a side. He wasn't elected to win political points. Pope Francis came to remind the world of a forgotten command.
Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me.
In a time when power often speaks louder than mercy, Francis did the unthinkable. He confronted systems, not just sinners. He denounced unfettered capitalism, calling it a new tyranny that destroys dignity in the name of profit. He didn't speak as a politician. He spoke as a shepherd who saw too many sheep being crushed under the weight of greed. This message resonated powerfully in circles shaped by the Catholic social teachings, and in movements like the Christian Reformed Church and Grace Christian Church, where economic justice is not a theory, it's a test of Christian love. He called on corporations and governments alike to treat the environment not as a resource to exploit, but as a sacred trust to protect.
The earth is our common home, he wrote in his groundbreaking encyclical Laudato Si, and it's crying out.
For many involved in the social teachings of the Catholic Church, this wasn't just ecological, it was spiritual. To wound the earth, in his eyes, was to wound the poor, those who suffer first and most when rivers dry, storms rage, and forests fall. But perhaps one of the most haunting images of his papacy was not taken inside the Vatican, but on a rocky shore in the Mediterranean. There, standing before the remnants of migrant boats, wood soaked with salt and human sorrow, Pope Francis offered Mass. Not in gold, not in grandeur, but on a makeshift altar, built from the broken pieces of lives lost at sea.
These are not statistics, he said. These are names. These are stories. These are children of God.
And yet, he was criticized fiercely, branded as too political, labeled a leftist pope, challenged by voices who believed he was stepping out of his lane. But Francis never wavered. He didn't walk with an ideology. He walked with the gospel. And the gospel doesn't care if you're red or blue. It only asks if you fed the hungry, welcomed the stranger, and clothed the naked. He didn't take sides. He took a stand. And that stood echoed in every corner of the church, from marked men for Christ retreats to Victory Christian Fellowship, from refugee camps to LDS baptism missions, from corporate boardrooms to back alley confessions. Pope Francis reminded the world that a cross is not just a decoration. It's a declaration that love without action is just a slogan, and power without compassion is something Christ would have overturned. He didn't come to please the crowd. He came to disturb it. Where he felt women, wounds, and the weight of failure. No legacy, however luminous, comes without shadow, and even Francis, perhaps especially Francis, had moments when the world expected more from him. He opened so many doors, but some he left closed. Despite his pastoral warmth and groundbreaking tone, Francis refused to allow women to become deacons or priests. Even when asked directly on national television, he replied with a quiet but resolute no. He cited the long-standing Petrine theory, claiming that because Christ chose male apostles, the church could not change its stance. To many, particularly those inspired by the 7 Catholic social teachings, this was not traditional, it was the contradiction. How could a pope who spoke of justice and dignity deny half the church the opportunity to serve at the altar? Movements like the Women's Ordination Conference and many within the Grace Christian Church and the Christian Reformed Church expressed disappointment, not with his theology, but with the silence that followed. Sometimes, the brightest light reveals the deepest shadows. And maybe the question isn't, what did he fail to do? But rather, did we help him enough to do it? Francis also found himself under fire in the wake of the church's ongoing sexual abuse crisis. Yes, he apologized. Yes, he changed internal protocols. Yes, he met with survivors. But one moment stood out in painful clarity: the Chilean scandal. Francis defended a bishop accused of covering up child abuse. He believed the bishop's testimony. He dismissed the victims' stories. Only later, when the evidence became undeniable, did he admit his mistake. He apologized, publicly and painfully. But for many survivors, especially those guided by the enduring Word Bible commentary and faithful to spiritual reading, the wound remained open. Because trust once broken is not easily mended, he also drew criticism for the way he addressed LGBTQ+ issues. Early in his papacy, he made headlines with the phrase,
"If someone is gay and seeks the Lord, who am I to judge?"
It was a shift in tone that felt hopeful to marked men in Vol Christ. He gets us Jesus, Sidiaton, and marked men for Christ. But then came moments that hurt. A casual slur used behind closed doors. A statement taken out of context. An apology is issued, but not always felt. Still, many in the LGBTQ+ community remembered something else: a quiet meeting. In a small Vatican room, Francis met with transgender Catholics. He listened. He didn't preach. He didn't dismiss. He just listened. One attendee later said,
"He looked at me like I was human. Like I belonged."
That moment didn't undo the damage, but it whispered, "This man is still learning." And maybe that means there's hope for the rest of us, too. Francis's failures don't define him, but they do complete the portrait. A portrait not of a perfect leader, but of a man who dared to walk into sacred contradictions. Even when he stumbled, the challenge is not to excuse his flaws. It's to, when we see leaders falter, will we demand punishment, or help them rise again? Because if we want a church that is both holy and human, we must be willing to accept what holiness looks like when it's still bleeding. After Francis, where does the church go from here? The doors are closing. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals gather. Silence falls. The world waits. And as the smoke rises, white or black, 1 billion hearts will hold their breath. When Pope Francis died, the church didn't just lose a leader. It lost its moral compass. A voice that whispered instead of roared. A shepherd who walked with a limp, but never lost the flock. And now, the question on every believer's mind is, what comes next? By the numbers, Francis may be gone, but his hands still guide the helm. Out of the 135 cardinals eligible to elect the next pope, 108 were appointed by Francis himself. That means the College of Cardinals, the highest-ranking body in the church, now reflects the spiritual DNA of a man who valued presence over prestige, pastors over politicians. These weren't career bureaucrats, they were priests from the margins. From South Sudan, Thailand, the Amazon, and forgotten villages in Asia and Africa, men shaped not by power, but by proximity to suffering. In the spirit of the social teachings of the Catholic Church, Francis chose leaders who knew how to wash feet before giving homilies. They weren't selected to preserve an empire. They were chosen to tend a field hospital, a church that bandages the broken instead of La Christianum. This deeply echoes the ethos found in Faith Christian Center gatherings, and is celebrated in communities like the Christian Reformed Church and the Grace Christian Church, where spiritual leadership is judged not by robes, but by radical empathy. Still, succession is never predictable. The conclave is sacred and secret. Politics and prayer mix in mysterious ways. And there's no guarantee that the next pope will follow in Francis's footsteps. Will he continue the open conversations around women, climate, and LGBTQ+ inclusion? Or will he retreat to Jesus' rigidity? Will he speak in the spirit of getting us Jesus and the Jesus ministry? Or settle for ceremonial distance? The stakes are not just internal, they're global. Because when the Catholic Church shifts, So do the tides of world culture, international diplomacy, and human rights. Francis lit a fire, but now, the fire is in other hands. And the real question is not just who will be elected, but whether the flame will be fed, or allowed to fade. The Church may wait for a new pope, but mercy waits for no one. A sinner sent to U.S. He never claimed to be a saint. He never wore perfection as a badge. He called himself a sinner. And in doing so, he permitted the rest of us to be honest, to be human, to still be holy. Pope Francis wasn't flawless. He disappointed many. He left some battles unfinished. But maybe that's the point. Maybe what the Church needed was not a hero in marble, but a servant in dust. Someone who didn't rise above the people, but walked beside them, through refugee camps, prison gates, polluted rivers, and digital comment sections. He wasn't the kind of pope who made everyone comfortable. He was the kind of pope who made everyone think. And in that tension, in that ache between heaven's ideals and earth's brokenness, he bore witness to grace. His life was called Jesus. Those in the Grace Christian Church, Marked Men Gets Us Jesus campaigns, in quiet corners of Marked Men for Christ, and spiritual reading circles. You don't need to be powerful to be faithful. You just need to show up where it hurts. He washed his feet. He kissed scars. He bent the rules for the sake of mercy. We don't need a perfect pope. We need a pope who kneels to wash feet and stands up to power. That is what Francis gave us. Not a closed doctrine, but an open wound. Not a monument, but a flame. A flame of compassion. A flame of bold tenderness. A flame the world tried to extinguish, but could not. If today were the day he left, then tomorrow would be the day we take his place. Not as popes, but as people of mercy. People who see the poor. People who hear the margins. People who say, yes, to walking the road that most avoid. Because the Church is not marble and smoke. It's the next person we stoop to serve. If this story stirred something in you, if the life of this humble, conflicted, courageous sinner has awakened a longing in your soul, then say it, live it, share it. Comment below.
I choose to carry the flame of mercy.
Share this video. Waiting for someone you love may be wandering in the dark, waiting for a pope that lives in you, to lead them home. Dove, this is not the end of Francis's story. It's the beginning of yours. Lord Jesus Christ, we thank BT but for sending us a shepherd who led not with a sword, but with an outstretched hand. Not with flawless words, but with a heart open to the wounded. Thank you for Pope Francis, a sinner like us, yet bold enough to kneel in your name. You called him to walk where many feared to go, to the outskirts of power, to the margins of society, to the quiet cry of the forgotten. Through him, you reminded us, mercy is not weakness. Compassion is not compromise. And truth, when wrapped in tenderness, can still shake kingdoms. Lord, now that he has returned to you, we ask, let his light not end with his life. Let it awaken something in us. Give us the courage to carry the flame, to speak for the voiceless, to listen more than we speak, to love beyond our comfort. May we build a church that does not shine from the top of towers, but glows from the corners of hospital rooms, shelters, and broken places. A church that looks less like a throne and more like a field hospital. Just as he envisioned. Let our generation not bury this legacy, but resurrect it. In our homes. In our churches. In our everyday encounters. We don't ask for greatness. We ask for gentleness. We ask for bold mercy. And the strength to walk in steps toward the hurting, toward the forgotten, toward you. In the name of the Good Shepherd who stoops to wash our feet. Amen.